We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Professor of Political Science at George Washington University, co-author with Michael Tesler and Lynn Vaverick of Identity Crisis, the 2016 presidential campaign and the battle for the meaning of America. John Sides, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start. This story of the 2016 election really starts closer to 2008, and I want to just start with one fact that just sort of blew me away, was that less than 50% of non-college educated white voters could place the Democrats to the left of the Republicans on the question of which party was more supportive of government assistance, I guess broadly, help for African Americans. Is that right? And what are the implications of that at that time?
What that's showing you is of course, that lots of people just don't pay close attention to politics and don't register features of political parties that to most political observers are well known and have been well known for years, if not decades. The reason that this changes, though, has to do with the presidency of Barack Obama. And in some sense, Barack Obama clarifies the party politics of race. And this helps voters who may have been paying less attention to politics come to realize that the Democratic Party is to the left of the Republican Party on these issues.
That, to me, is stunning because there was plenty of I've seen studies that suggest that I guess the idea of government support becomes racialized right before this, but it's not lined up with the parties until essentially people see that a black guy is the Democratic nominee.
Yeah, especially for voters who had less formal education, the alignment of their partisanship and their racial attitudes really was a feature of the Obama era. And what that did, of course, overall was just to strengthen the correlation in the American population more generally, so that people who have views of immigration that are more favorable or want more immigration, or people that have views of racial inequality that think that it has mostly to do with slavery and discrimination, those people are increasingly Democrats. And if you have a view that is more concerned about the level of immigration and wants to reduce it, or if you have a view of racial inequality that says that it's mostly about blacks not trying hard enough or not working hard enough, then those people are increasingly Republicans. So maybe maybe people are changing their views about immigration to match their partisanship, or maybe they're updating their partisanship to align with their views of race and immigration. But either way, we end up with a country where the standard way that we contest elections, Democrat versus Republican, is now not just a debate about, let's say, how large government should be, which it has been for years and years and years. Now it's a debate about what kind of country we're going to be, how exclusive or inclusive we're going to be toward these different kinds of groups.
And I mean, in some ways, I feel that some of us here, I'm speaking literally in this room, have been guilty of assuming that these things were already racialized, right? I mean, because race has played such an enormous part in our politics. But I guess so the big difference is really just sort of this new level of sorting that's taking place, right? That has been really basically an 8 to 10 year process.
That's absolutely right. I mean, there's no question that racial politics have been endemic in American politics from the founding. But the ways in which people's views about race and their own racial identities align with partisanship is a much more recent phenomenon.
And even like in the context of like the Dixiecrats and whatnot, and LBJ saying we're going to lose the South because of these issues for a decade. He turned out to be a little bit a little bit off, but even then, I mean, this is so it all comes down. Well, let's just start with this. I mean, where do you guys? I mean, tell us about the research that you did that you started to come across this notion. Did you enter into this work with an awareness that this dynamic had taken place?
Yes, I mean, in part because my co-author Michael Tesler had previously written 2 different books about the politics of race during the Obama era. One about his 2008 presidential campaign, and then a second book about his not only his presidential campaigns but his presidency more generally. And we knew this was happening. And there are some, there's been a lot of attention in the political science literature to this concept of sorting and to the ways in which Democrats and Republicans, may increasingly differ from each other on a variety of policy issues. But what Michael was able to show in his work on the Obama era was that this sorting came to encompass racial issues as well as more general kinds of ideological issues. However, I think that this more general trend towards sorting may or may not have been as consequential in 2016 had it not been for the 2016 campaign itself. I mean, there was plenty of sorting already underway by 2012, but yet the role of issues like immigration and race in 2016 was clearly greater than in 2012, or that's what our evidence suggests. And that tells you that a lot of it had to do with the specific choices of the candidates in terms of their ideas and messages in 2016 and how those differed from other recent presidential elections.
Okay, so conceptually, to understand this, it's almost as if there was something like a dormant virus embedded in all of us, and the environment in 2012 or 2008 brought that to the fore, and then in 2012, it was a little bit less, the environment was a little bit less stimulating to that virus. And then in 2016, that virus or allergy or however you want to conceptualize it was even magnified because of the context. Is that sort of like conceptually the right way to think about that?
I think that's right. I mean, sometimes we talk about it with kind of an agricultural metaphor, which is, aspects of the Obama era kind of fertilized the soil for more racially charged politics, and that made probably increased the likelihood that that kind of racially charged politics could be potent if the candidates were to really embrace that. And Obama obviously didn't. He was always trying to moderate on questions of race. He didn't talk about it as frequently as some other Democratic presidents. He took very careful positions. McCain and Romney, really did not want to run heavily racialized campaigns and explicitly rejected certain kinds of tactics that might have played the race card in a more explicit way. But of course, for Trump and Clinton, it was a very different kind of election altogether.
All right. Well, let's talk about that in terms of, because my understanding is that Clinton found herself, relative from 2008 to 2016, the way that she was perceived on race and as reflected in her supporters almost flipped. Is that right?
Yes. Basically, of course, in 2008, her coalition was built around primarily white voters in the Democratic primaries, and especially white voters who had more conservative views on racial issues. And in 2016, it flips that now her coalition, she gains all this support among African Americans, loses some support among whites overall, and the role of white primary voters' racial attitudes just doesn't really matter as much anymore because there's no African American candidate on the ballot, and Clinton and Sanders are not really different in their own views about racial inequality. So yeah, it was basically a coalition that became the inverse of itself. So
how do you measure this stuff? Because 2008, it's not. we had our first black presidential candidate. We also were coming out of or entering into, the most severe economic, I guess, event in generations. How do you sort of parse this stuff out? Like, how do you determine what is operative, because I imagine there's a lot of things that go into, the question of who am I going to vote for? How do you parse these out, and how do you determine what is the sort of the driving factor?
Sure. What we did in looking at the 2016 election was we did as many comparisons to recent presidential elections as we could, because we wanted to distinguish what is distinctive about 2016 from what is kind of a chronically important factor in presidential elections. In which case, if it's chronically important, then the story isn't really about 2016. It's just a broader story about American presidential elections. One of the ways that we did this was with a unique survey that interviewed the same group of voters first in the 2012 election. We talked to them in December 2011, so almost a year before they voted. And we talked to them in November 2012 after they had voted, and we asked them, did you vote Obama or did you vote Romney? And then 4 years later, right after the 2016 election, we were able to re-interview those same voters. And so we could see, how they voted in both elections and who shifted from Obama to Trump or from Romney to Clinton. And we could compare the relative impact of their views about a variety of different issues that we had measured way back in 2011, well before, both campaigns, but especially 2016. And we found that it was these things about race and immigration that although in some cases they certainly appeared to correlate strongly with your choice between Obama and Romney, that those correlations increased in 2016. Other factors didn't necessarily show that same pattern.
How do you, what are the type of questions that you ask to make that determination where you pull it apart?
Very good question. So we can break up a couple different topics. Take racial inequality. We're asking people whether they agree or disagree with a series of statements. And the statements are designed to get at, do you attribute racial inequality to structural forces like discrimination, or do you attribute it to the fact that, to your belief that blacks don't work hard enough? So generations of slavery and discrimination have made it difficult for blacks to get ahead. That's, do you agree or disagree? Or you may ask them, it's just a question of trying harder. If blacks would only try hard enough, they could be as well off as whites. Do you agree or disagree? So we asked those kinds of questions to measure views of immigration. It's the three questions that we had in the survey when we first did it in 2011 were, do you want to increase or decrease immigration? Do you want to, or keep it the same? And then do you support a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants? And then thirdly, do you think that undocumented immigrants are benefit or drain on society? So, we combine these questions together to get, kind of indexes or scales that measure people's views on these issues. To do one more example, where there's a lot of discussion about the role of economics and economic anxiety. And so in both 12 and 16, this is now in a different survey project, but a really nice battery of questions. How worried are you about losing your job? How likely is it that you're not going to be able to make a mortgage or rent payment in the coming months, or not be able to make a health care payment? Several questions of that nature. So really designed to get at what I think people really thought were the driving insecurities, even after 8 years of economic recovery since the recession. And we just found that those economic anxiety measures really didn't strongly correlate with your vote in either election, 12 or 16, and didn't correlate more strongly in 16 than 12.
Were there significant differences in the way that people answered those questions? So you're asking the same people in 2011 that you are in 2016. Do their answers change at all? Did you see any, did people become more or less, express more or less, I guess, racist views, or, however you want to?
Sure, very good question. Overall, no. There aren't really big shifts in people's overall views about immigration or race or things like that. One of the metaphors that we use to illustrate this, sometimes people talk about Trump's victory or the success of right-wing populist parties, and European countries as a wave. It's a wave of populist sentiment. But if by populist sentiment you mean things like concern about immigration, there is no wave. It's not that like the public was becoming less open to immigration, and that's what Trump was able to ride to victory. What we would say is that public opinion on questions like race and immigration and other issues is really more like a reservoir. There's a range of sentiments from positive to negative or favorable to unfavorable. And the question is, are those sentiments going to be mobilized and therefore become more powerfully predictive of people's choices? And again, that's where the decisions of the candidates come in.
So it's and let me ask the same question about the economic anxiety measures.
Sure.
Was there any movement from 2011 to 2016?
Yeah, the American public became less economically anxious, which again it's a mystery to me why this was so undercovered going into the 2016 election. But there have been 50 years of survey data that ask people things like, how are your personal finances doing? Are they getting better or worse? What about the national economy? Do you think it's getting better or worse? What about in a year from now? Do you think you'll be better then or worse off then? The standard battery of questions showed pretty clearly that the public was getting more economically confident. And again, this is just tracking the actual the recovery from the recession. It's not to suggest that like every problem had been solved,
right?
But in terms of what the public was seeing, it clearly reflected a belief that the economy was getting better. And what's been remarkable to me is that since Trump's gotten elected, there's much more news coverage now about the economic recovery, the growth rate, the unemployment rate, people's positive views. Now the question is, why isn't the positive economy helping Trump or helping the Republican Party? But if you look at people's actual views about the economy, they're only a little bit better than they were in 2016. So again, I think in some sense the popular impression of the campaign really missed the boat on what was happening in public opinion overall.
And was that sort of improved perspective on the economy? Was that equally distributed across different income levels and wealth levels and all different sort of subgroups that you would look at?
Very good question. So the answer is yes. That you can segment the public based on how much formal education they have. You can segment them based on their income level. And the trends are moving in parallel. So like every group, every educational group and income group is becoming more favorable about the economy. And in fact, the ironic thing about the comparisons across the income groups is that during the Obama years, there were actually fewer differences between the wealthiest and the least wealthy Americans in their views of the economy. So in some sense, the income differences shrank during Obama, far from it being the case that they were growing because the wealthy people thought the economy was doing much better, but the poor people thought it wasn't. The only really thing that differentiates people's perceptions of the economy overall is just partisanship. And, Democrats and Democratic-leaning people were much more likely to perceive that economic growth than Republicans because the Republicans didn't want to give credit to a Democratic president. And this kind of partisan bias in economic perceptions is a pretty chronic feature of contemporary American politics. So if you wanted to find the really angry people or the so-called economically anxious people, it was really Republicans tired of being out of the White House for 8 years. It wasn't due to social class or income or anything like that.
And much of your research suggests that race or that party becomes a surrogate for racial questions. Is that right? I mean, is that
yes.
Okay? So yeah, so explain that to us.
The party becomes a surrogate for
the racial views that you have. That like the more things become racialized. I mean, so just even getting back to the immigration point you were making. people had the same feelings towards immigration. It's just that they didn't realize they could express them in like the political arena. Like, is that like a way of conceiving it?
I may maybe put it slightly differently. I mean, they express them. I mean, they'll tell you their views. I mean, at least if you believe survey data. But again, like,
but you can't act on them. You can actually act on them within the context of politics, and they didn't understand that before.
Well, I mean, I think from the standpoint of social science, right? There's a lot of different ingredients that can go into my choice between a Democratic and Republican candidate, and we know that partisanship is always going to be a factor. And it was a strong factor in 2016, as it has been in previous elections. But the question is, other factors. Well, it depends, right? It depends on, first of all, what are the candidates talking about? Are you getting enough information to think that this is an important issue? What positions are the candidates taking? If they're taking the same position, then it doesn't really help you choose to think about that issue because they're not, they're carbon copies of each other. So again, what I think makes a difference for voters is to see, first of all, a lot of discussion about an issue, which brings it to the top of your head and makes it a more salient part of your thinking, and then to see the candidates sharply differ on that question. And so what you saw in 2016 that was different than 2012 or 2008 was both this sort of extraordinary emphasis on all of these issues tied to race, ethnicity, and immigration, and also very, very sharp differences between Trump's positions, of course, which attracted controversy for the entire duration of the campaign, and Clinton's positions, which we argue were to the left of Obama's, probably, and more generally, of course, she was structuring her entire campaign in many ways as a rejection of Trump. And so I think if you were a voter, now you had a very clear contrast on an issue that was being discussed more frequently than it had been. So that's what makes your own views about immigration now become activated and a more important influence on your choice.
I see. So as I grow older, I may think that, tax deductions for mortgages on homes are more important than I did when I was, 22, I guess. But in this instance, it is outside of me. That remains a constant, and suddenly the candidates are talking about tax deductions on home mortgages and how important they are, and I may become more attuned to it at an earlier age, just for example.
Yeah, and it's not to say that people don't make choices based on factors that are, kind of intrinsic or idiosyncratic to them.
Right.
I certainly also care a lot more about the mortgage interest deduction than I did 20 years ago. And it's not to say that we can reduce people's choices in 2016 or any election to one factor or one set of factors. But what I would typically say, again, is if we want to see what is distinctively important about voting behavior in one election as opposed to other elections, right, that a lot of that's going to depend on the choices and the messages of the candidates.
And this is and this was one of those things that was different than the other, essentially, is what stuck out. And so